welcome. I'm Phoebe Jackson. I'm a physics teacher at John Abbott College. I'm also a Saltese Fellow, and I'm your animator for today on behalf of Saltese. I'm going to share my screen, so just give me a minute to set it up. Oh,
yeah, go
Sue.
ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. All right, there we go. Almost. Okay, so before we begin, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the plan for the next 90 odd minutes. So after a short introduction from me, you're going to hear from 3 educational researchers who have been exploring and supporting group work in post-secondary classrooms. After each presentation, there's going to be approximately 5 minutes for a little Q&A, but don't worry if you don't have time to ask your questions then, because the second half of the webinar is going to be an open panel discussion with more question and answer. So the panel for the second half will consist of our 3 presenters, Josh Ives from UBC, Kelly Miller from Harvard, Matt Olin from Purdue, as well as 3 other researchers and teachers. So we'll have Jackie Stewart from UBC, Sydney Obalom from McGill, and Michael Dugdale from John Abbott. So to begin our continued exploration of group work, I'm going to emphasize the main goals of today's webinar. The diagram you see here is similar to the one I showed last month, and it's designed to help us visualize how we make our decisions about group work. So the dark blue bubble represents the context within which our class is situated. So things like who our students are, their backgrounds and contexts, the institutional requirements, the mandated curriculum. And working within both the affordances and the constraints of our context, we use our understandings of best practices to make decisions about how and what we're going to teach. Today's webinar is going to emphasize the idea that despite our unique contexts and constraints, or perhaps because of our unique context and constraints, we should be using the huge body of educational research to support our decision making. So our goal today is to let you know what the research says about group work, but also, and importantly, how we can interpret this research within our varied contexts. So we can start with this idea of effective group work. What I think we're probably all looking for, I know I certainly am, is a way of managing and making effective groups. But what do we even mean by effective? So as we talked about last month, there's many different reasons for using group work, which means there's also many different ways of thinking about what makes a group effective. And if we're going to make a ton of decisions, as we have to do as teachers, when using group work in our class, we have to first decide what we're actually looking for in an effective group, and that's based on our own context. The list you see here, which is provided by Josh Ives, who's going to be presenting very soon, gives us some options for doing this, keeping in mind that our contexts are different, and so we might make different choices. But as we're going to continually be emphasizing today, these choices should still be evidence-based. So here's a few questions that emerged out of part 1 of the Teamwork Challenge, last month's webinar. I'll read them to you. What principles can we use to build our practices given our range of teaching contexts? What impacts do our choices on group work have on our students, and how does this intersect with issues such as gender, race, and socioeconomic status? And when we talk about homogeneous versus heterogeneous groups, what dimensions are we actually talking about? Is it academic ability? Is it soft skills like ability to communicate or problem solve, or is it something else perhaps? So these are here just so you can keep them in mind as we move into the presentations, and we'll come back to these same questions when we move into the panel discussion. So now we're on to our first researcher, Joss Ives is a professor of teaching in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at UBC. So Joss, it's over to you now.
Thank you, Phoebe, and it's my pleasure to be here. I attended the last session and I had really great planning meetings with everybody involved, so that I'm really excited. Yeah, so the context that I'm going to be discussing today is two-stage group exams and some of the different things that we can draw out of some of the data that can be gathered related to those. And if you're not familiar with two-stage group exams, it's the idea that the students will take their regular solo or individual exam, and then afterward, they will get into groups. 3, 4 is kind of typical numbers, even though different people make different choices, and then they will actually retake the exam. Sometimes the exam's a little bit different, sometimes it's exactly the same. So go ahead, Phoebe. And we really think of these as being for feedback. We're engaging the students when they're the most receptive to feedback. Right after that exam, when they want to be having those conversations in the hallway, we actually let them talk about it for marks instead. We actually use self-selected groups of 3 to 4, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. We don't fix the membership, so if we do have multiple exams over the course of a semester, students can switch groups as much as they like. Typically, most of the data I'm going to talk about today are coming from courses with approximately 700 students across 3 sections, even though it varies a little bit. Please, Phoebe. So some of the key topics I want to talk about are this impact of the group composition with something that is fairly visible and something we worry about is the group composition with respect to forced binary gender. And I'm saying forced binary gender because at our institution, the data that we have are the forced binary gender that students identify when they had registered for the university. I'm also going to talk about heterogeneous versus homogeneous grouping, specifically with respect to student performance. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about some considerations when you are actually letting groups self-select, since this is kind of the space I've been operating in the most. Phoebe, go ahead. Thank you. So starting on this topic of gender composition, the literature, broadly speaking, suggests that we should avoid gender isolation. A lot of these studies actually came in context of longer groups as opposed to the shorter or ad hoc groups, but we can still investigate what's going on. They also typically were involved with groups that were instructor formed as opposed to student formed. But I'll just highlight a few things. One of the seminal papers from physics education research related to group exams was looking at this idea that there's some dysfunction in groups with isolated women, and not only was there dysfunction, but those groups actually didn't perform as well. There's a different study that was with business students that actually saw that isolated men within groups actually collaborated less than when they weren't isolated. And then there's this wonderful lab study by Dasgupta that shows that women feel less anxious and they participate more when they are equally represented or have higher numbers within their group. And there are some other studies that see very similar things in terms of women's participation within groups with respect to how many women there are in the group. Phoebe, thank you. So the first thing I want to look at is we have tons and tons of data. The data I'm going to talk about right now are 3 consecutive years or terms worth of final exam data with using 2-stage group exams in a roughly 700-person introductory physics course. And just so you have a little bit of context, you can see the light blue bars versus the dark blue bars, how the students did when they were on their own taking the test or when they got into groups taking the test. And you see that the groups were quite successful in general, and the original exams were not overly difficult by our, oops, got it. So what we did is we actually built some models to predict how the groups would actually do on the group exam based on the performance of all the individuals in the exam. And then we included some variables that could account for gender composition. Phoebe. Could go next slide, Phoebe, thanks. So one of the things that we saw, if you look at this graph, is along the bottom, we have different types of gender composition of groups. We had groups of 3 or 4 typically. So on the far left is all male, on the far right is all female, and then kind of the spectrum as it goes from one to the other. And we see along the y-axis a normalized, so this will be measured in standard deviations with respect to the mean, normalized scores of those groups with respect to all the other groups. And you can see that it looks like the group which is the second one and the group which is the fourth one, which is isolated females and isolated males respectively, are doing more poorly than the other types of group on the surface, right? So this is something, if you were just looking at your exam data, this is a thing you could definitely spot if you had access to that sort of thing. Advance, please, Phoebe. Thank you. However, if we actually model what we've been doing here, we found that one of the most highly predictive things, and if you think about it, not that surprising, is the score of the top performer in the group. And if you just look at the scores of the top performer in the group, which is the bottom graph, it almost exactly mirrors the top graph. So when you control for this top performer, this effect that is these two types of groups that were not performing as well when you just looked at the group scores actually goes away. And there's a bunch of different ways we've looked at this, and that basically there's no predictive power by group type once you start introducing some of these variables like top performer. So on the surface, it looks like there is actually no disadvantage by this measure, even though we thought, okay, maybe there is. Phoebe. Thank you. I'm just going to check Tamara's question real quick here. Yeah, so thanks, Tamara. That's a extremely valuable point. The data that I'm talking about today are all from university records and not from student self-reported records. So this is the context that you need to be having in mind. So we followed this up and we did a question level analysis of these mixed gender groups, only mixed gender groups. So we isolated those groups from everywhere else. So those were the 3 middle group types of the ones that we were looking at before. And we saw that men actually have a higher influence on the group answers than women. And how did we do this? I'm just going to run you through this really quick so you can get a sense of how we saw this. We looked, once we isolated the mixed gender groups, we looked at groups where only one person had the correct answer. And then we said, you know, if this person was a man or a woman, how likely was it that they were able to get the group to follow their answer and actually answer correctly? And you can see that, you know, broadly speaking, it's in the 50 to 60% range that if only one person is correct, they're able to bring the whole group along for their answer. That's great news in terms of how group exams work. The more troubling issue is that the women seem to be less able to have the group follow their answer. And if you know odds ratios, it's an odds ratio of approximately 1.5 in terms of the women being able to have the group follow them as opposed to the men. From effect size perspective, we would call this a small effect. Yes, there's a whole bunch of ways you can think about this. So I'm trying to be very careful with my language, right? I often think of it as the women are not being given the space and are maybe not being listened to when they are even being given the space. So we see from the perspective of people following a correct answer, the women have less influence on the group answers than the men. Now on the right, you can see, and I'm going to zoom in on this graph in a second, but this is what happens if there's only one incorrect person in the group and how likely that incorrect person is going to be able to have the group follow their incorrect answer. And it's very, very low, right? It's just 1 or 2%. However, we can zoom in on this and see that you know, okay, so it's actually around 2-3% or something like that, that the men are also more able to get the group to follow their answer, even if it's wrong. And, you know, in this case, the odds ratio is a little bit bigger and the effect is a little bit bigger, but it's still actually, it's consistent across both correct and incorrect answers. And importantly, going back to the previous slides that I was talking about, we don't actually see an effect. Oh, sorry, I didn't actually mean to go back, Phoebe, but thanks. That we didn't actually see an effect for isolated gender. So if we do some of this work, but we just pay attention to isolated gender, or we also include isolated gender, that's not happening. So it's, as long as you're in a mixed group, we're seeing these effects with men and women in terms of how they influence the group's answer. All right, Phoebe, I'll go to the next one. How am I doing for time, Phoebe?
You're okay for now. You're
right.
you're a bit less than 10 minutes in, if that helps.
Thank you. I liked the first qualitative answer. So, one of the things that I also wanted to talk about was this notion of heterogeneous versus homogeneous grouping by performance. And it's a bit of a shit show in the literature, to be perfectly honest. There's nothing conclusive. There's nothing you can hang your hat on. The most conclusive things are probably that groups that have a little bit of performance diversity, but not a lot of performance diversity, are actually kind of the most beneficial to everybody across the board. But they have these examples of, if you have a low, medium, and high, the low and high students form some sort of teacher-student partnership, and then the medium student has nothing to do. There's a whole bunch of issues that, no matter which way you try to look at it, there's a whole bunch of issues that crop up. So nothing very conclusive. Phoebe, I'll go to the next one. And so we did want to look at it, and we also found nothing conclusive. We did, after a group exam, we asked some isomorphic follow-up questions in class. I'm isolating here just the students who had been in the lower third of the overall scores on the test, and how they did on these clicker questions as compared to how they did on the test. So that's what I'm calling gain along the y-axis. And you can see, based on the diversity of the performance within the groups that they were in, there's no noticeable difference by group type, right? And so there's a few different ways you can look at this, and there's a lot of people that have tried and not seen a lot, and there's a few people who've looked at it and seen some things. That's, so that's what I'm saying. It's a bit of a shit show. Phoebe, I'll carry on. The last piece I'm going to talk about is some self-selected group considerations that you might want to have in mind. So one of the things is that there's a lot of affective pieces that come in with the self-selected groups. And this is something that Matt had actually referred to in the previous webinar, where group cohesion is much higher, like the initial group cohesion is much higher with self-selected groups. And if you look at the points I'm going to say, these are consistent with that sort of idea. So we get this idea from Theobald and some of their colleagues that, comfort working with the group predicts a higher content mastery. They go in, there's more cohesion, they're able to maybe be productive quicker. However, having a friend in the group predicts comfort, but does not ultimately predict content mastery. So these are these knock-on effects that you have to sometimes be able to look at. We also see from different places in the literature that people that do have marginalized identities, when they go into group work, it can be very stressful and actually occupy a lot of their brain space, paying attention to how their marginalized identity is interacting with the rest of the group. And so there's actually a lot of demand on cognitive resources. And self-selected groups can reduce that. They don't necessarily, but there is an opportunity for self-selected groups to introduce that. However, with instructor form groups, in the long term, they might develop the relationship such that that's no longer an issue either. Phoebe. So the last thing I want to speak to is, we did a bunch of surveys, and we've been surveying students for quite a while on their experiences within group exams. And two of the key things that we noticed were predicting high results in these surveys in terms of students, they're reporting their self-reported outcomes, is one, if they had prearranged their groups, students tend to have a much more favorable experience, and some other outcomes we were looking at were also favorable. And two, if they said that they engaged in consensus decision-making within the group, so instead of just voting and picking that answer and moving on, that everybody kind of had to agree on the answer before they actually chose it. Those were two of the markers. So we wanted to look at what supporting self-selected groups could actually do to improve this for the whole class instead of just those students who had a good ability to form those groups ahead of time. So what we did is before a midterm, we held a review session and asked students to identify their groups before they came to the review session, work in the review session, and then work in those groups in the group exam. And then if they didn't have a group that they were intending to work with in the group, the review, we would organize a group for them. They could indicate that to us ahead of time, and they could even know who's in their group before the review. And in the worst case scenario, once they got to the review, we would find them a group. And so they would still know who was going to be in their group and have an opportunity to engage with them before the actual exam. So this is the intervention. We had this review session that did this, and we actually talked a little bit about some productive group work ideas within the review session as well. We made all of these materials available to the control sections as well, but it just happened to be that there was a snow day, so one section had a bonus day that we were able to do this in. So we took advantage of it and did that in the one section. Phoebe. Thank you. And so what happened? Well, what you see is on this graph on the far right is the number of students that reported to have completely prearranged their groups when we asked them after the group exam, what level of prearrangement did they have for their group? And you see that in the control section, which is green, we had a huge increase in the number of groups that actually reported to have prearranged the groups. Phoebe. Thank you. So we looked at the surveys again, and I have some really nasty graphs that we won't go through, but I'll just summarize the findings. The finding is maybe a little bit counterintuitive. What we found is that the additional prearranged groups that formed, right? So there's a baseline of the number of groups that would form as prearranged groups if you just say, hey, work with whoever you want. And we're seeing that's maybe about 35% of the students will get in, completely form those groups. The additional, 80%, so the difference between 35 and 80, so another 50% of the students that got into these prearranged groups because we really encouraged them to do so, it seems like the benefits from prearranging for those students weren't as high as the people who would have freely prearranged. So maybe that's actually not counterintuitive, but on the surface, at first it seems a little bit counterintuitive. Other notes, and I already mentioned this a little bit, but our positive survey outcomes continue to correlate with the amount of consensus decision making. We ask people how familiar they are with people in their group in terms of, we called it academic familiarity, so not just friends, and even just having a friend in their group. And all these things do predict better outcomes in the group exams. And this continued to be true in this case when we did these prearrangements. So I think I'll go to the next one. So my implications, this is my last slide, and thank you, everybody. One of the things that I would say is a takeaway from what I've been discussing is there are inequities in voice and there is marginalization within groups that are likely to be present, even if you kind of collect some surface level data on your groups to see if they're working well, right? I had to really dig deep at the question level to start seeing some of these inequities show up. For us, this hybrid solution of letting students self-select, but actually putting some measures in place to help support that self-selection, having a form that they sign up for if they don't have people that they want to work with specifically ahead of time, and then letting them know who their group is, those sorts of things. That would be what we would advocate for if you are going to do any sort of self-selection. Also, actually supporting their decision-making processes, talking to students about the value of getting everybody on board to agree to the answers before moving on and not just voting or not just going with the most confident person. We have lots of data from the surveys that are saying that consensus decision-making is really a key predictor. And then finally, context and pedagogical priorities are really important when you synthesize all these different things and try to actually do something in your own class, right? So I will stop there, and then Phoebe, you can tell me if we'll just do questions later or if there's any time now.
Let's just take, there was one question here, if you think you can address it, or we can get back to it later. Alan was asking about your error bars and I think what's making them so big. Alan, if I understand your question.
On which specific graph? Because I was even inconsistent in my error bar representation between standard error and 95% confidence intervals. So sometimes they're twice as big just because they're 95% confidence intervals.
Alan, are you able to clarify your question? Maybe, Joss, while we wait for that, Michael also just asked a quick question. With your two-stage exams, are the group exams questions very similar to the individual?
Yeah, we actually typically use nearly identical. I have a colleague who refers to it as the sting in the tail, where you sometimes maybe if you have a multi-part problem, you might add a further part to that problem that would challenge the really high performing groups. But in general, we really think of this as a feedback mechanism for the students. And so we want them to focus on being able to talk about the things they had just been thinking about.
Okay, and I think someone has their hand up. Nate?
Yeah, I had a question on, you were looking into how men and women can influence either correct answers or incorrect answers. And I wondered if you looked into that in terms of what their influence was in if they were a solo person, if they were in a group with only one man or only one woman, and if there was any difference in their ability to influence the rest of the group in those contexts.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Nate. Yeah, so we did look into that. We looked into it along gender lines and also just the kind of isolated person as a variable on its own without looking specifically at gender. Because as we saw in the looking at the overall group scores, it looks like there might be just a thing for being isolated gender in your group anyway. And we did not at the question level see anything. And we're controlling for a bunch of variables when we're doing this. We're controlling for the group score, how that person is doing relative to the rest of the group and things like that. So once you're controlling for those things, those effects weren't showing up. And the only effect was if you're in a mixed gender group and you are a man or a woman, your outcomes in terms of influencing your group are different.
Okay, thank you so much, Joss. We're going to move on next to Kelly Miller from Harvard University. Kelly is a instructor and researcher in applied physics.
Okay, great. Thanks, Phoebe. And thanks for having me here today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this class that I've been teaching for a number of years in the School of Engineering at Harvard called Applied Physics 50. And for those of you who were here for the last part of the seminar, this is the same context that I spoke about then. It's a team-based class where the students are organized into groups that the instructors form 3 times over the course of the semester. So it's a project-based course. The students work on 3 month-long projects. And for each of those projects, they are placed into a team of 4 or 5. So we have a system that we use for grouping that I'll speak about in a second. So we put them together into like a group and for project 1, and then we mix up the teams and put them into a new team for project 2, and then the same thing for project 3. And so we have a lot of data that we've collected over the past 7 years that we've been teaching this class, because there's 3 projects over the course of each semester, and there's about 15 teams per project. So if you go to the next slide, Phoebe. So one of the things that we're interested in is understanding what are the things that we should be using to form these teams. You know, we feel, based on all of the literature, that it's important that we form the teams and we don't allow the students to self-select, given the fact that all of the evaluation and basically all of the activities, the projects, we also do 2-part collaborative exams, and all of those things happen in the context of these teams. And so we've been doing research on the most sort of predictive things from a grouping perspective for predicting like high functioning teams and also teams that enjoy working together. So if you go, so these are some of the things that we've been looking at: gender balance. We look at students' incoming physics background, and you know, we normalize that across the teams. We look at how they're performing on these two-part collaborative exams, and we try to distribute performance across the teams. And then we also make it so that no student is working with the same student twice. So like their previous team membership is one of the things that goes into like the team formation, as well as we have them take a survey that defines their working style preference. So if you think of like a project as being comprised of several sort of phases, like you first have kind of a brainstorming process, and then you have this like explore and sort of analyze and then execute. You know, different people are, they excel in different sort of phases of a project. Some people are very good at the like brainstorming phase. Some people are very good at the analysis phase. Some people are good at the execution. And so we had students take a survey that defined that their strengths in terms of sort of like the workflow of a project. And we experimented with what happens if you put students who are all similar in that regard on one team. So like the homogeneous versus heterogeneous, very similar to what Joss was just talking about. And then the last sort of thing that we've been experimenting with is empathy. So we have another survey that measures how empathetic a student is, like how sort of attuned they are, or how good they are at being able to recognize another student's feelings. There's some literature that suggests that teams that have the ability to be empathetic towards other members tend to perform better. And so we've also done some experiments with empathy. So these are the sorts of things that we've been looking at. So if you go on to the next slide. So and then how do we measure team effectiveness? Well, we're looking at two different outputs. So we're looking at sort of just like the performance data across the projects. Like there's a lot of deliverables over the course of the semester for each project. They have to give a presentation. They have to write a final report. They're taking all of these two-part collaborative exams in the team. So we look at like all the performance, like basically their grades. And then we've also, at the end of each team experience, we ask them to rate the overall sort of effectiveness of their team and like how productive they thought the experience was. So those are the two sort of metrics that we're using to evaluate team effectiveness. If you go on to the next slide. Okay, so so this is some data that looks at the idea of like, if you compare homogeneous versus heterogeneous teams on those two metrics, team performance, the plot on the left, and then team rating, the plot on the right. So we the learning, or not the learning, the work style diversity metric that I just mentioned, you know, which is like what is your style when it comes to working on a project? Like, do you focus on the analysis or the execution or the brainstorming? We made teams where all the students on a team were the same. They all, for example, loved to execute, and there was nobody on the team that was like a good brainstormer. And then we had teams where it was, you know, everyone was mixed up. So like you had like a few people, or like one or two people of each of the different styles. And so what we found was that groups that were homogeneous teams did not perform as well as heterogeneous teams, which is probably not very surprising, but they rate their experience as just as high. So there's really no like discernible difference in terms of like how they rated their experience, whether they were on a team with all the same people or mixed up people. Okay, next slide. So we also looked at very similar to Joss, the gender balance versus isolated. we try to balance the teams for gender. Occasionally we mess up, you know, just the data, or sometimes we don't have the gender data, and so we're doing it based on names, and that's always problematic. And so we've made mistakes over the years where we've had by accident really teams where there was one person, like one male isolated on a team of female students, or vice versa. And so we took advantage of that mistake and analyzed both the team performance and the team rating. And we found that gender isolated teams don't perform as well, similar to what Joss found. But they don't seem to mind in terms of like their, you know, they rate the experience just as highly, if regardless of whether they're on a gender balanced team or not. Okay, go to the next slide. Okay, and then lastly, empathy. So this is something that we've just recently started to look into. We have the students take a survey at the beginning of the semester that basically rates how empathetic they are. And we purposely like mixed up, mixed up the metric, or, you know, the people on that basis. So we had some teams that were, the average empathy score was lower than others. And so what we found is that higher empathetic teams perform better, and they rate their experience as better as well. So that's interesting, and we have to sort of investigate that a little bit more in depth to really understand what might be behind that. Okay, so that's like all of that data is in the context of this project-based team. The next little section, so Phoebe, if you go to the next slide. So I have a colleague who is teaching a traditional physics class at Harvard, not in the engineering school, in the physics department. And he, so it's not project-based and it's not team-based. It's just like a traditional lecture. And he does 2-part collaborative exams. And he typically lets the students just pick their own groups. And something that I have observed just like talking to the students is that it seems to be like the Wild West in his class, because and there's a lot of kind of jockeying the night before one of these exams for students to get into like what they perceive as a smart group. And so we did this experiment where we had he has 2 exams. So for the first exam, he let the students choose the groups like they normally do. And then for the second exam, I made the groups based on my AP 50 like sorting algorithm. And we intended to do this experiment a second time where we switched the order, right? So like the way we did it was they picked the group first and then we picked the group second. And we wanted to do it again to make sure that the order was, you know, to see if there was any difference. Like if you do, we picked the groups first, they picked the group second, whether that changes the dynamic. But we weren't able to because everything moved online before we had a chance to repeat the experiment. But so what I'm about to show you, it really only represents the first half of this experiment, but I think it still shows some interesting results. So this is what we did. So exam 1, they chose their teams like they normally did. Exam 2, I made the teams based on distributing performance. We have them take the force concept inventory at the beginning of the semester, and then we also used like their exam 1 performance, and we distributed that throughout all the teams. And then we tried to the best of our ability to make the teams balanced in gender. And we surveyed them after the second exam. So after they experienced both conditions, we surveyed them, we asked them these 2 questions. So we asked them, to what extent do you agree with the statement that having the members of their group assigned by the teaching staff improved the fairness of the exam? So that they had to state like agree or disagree, like on a 5-point scale. And then the second question was, for the group exam, my performance, for the group exam, my preference is to have the teaching staff. So I would prefer to have the teaching staff assign me. Okay, so if you go to the next slide, okay, so this is looking at the two conditions, male versus female, the differential between the individual and the group. So on the y-axis of this graph is like group exam score minus individual score for each person. Okay, so it's like the difference between how did you do when you participated in the group versus how did you do individually. And we broke it down by gender. And then you can see exam 1 is the first 2 set of bars, and then exam 2 is the second 2 set of bars. So we were really surprised by this, because what it looks like is that when you let the students choose their groups, it advantages women, right? There's like the women, the differential for the women's scores is higher than for the men's score. Whereas when we balance when we like make it contrived and we balance the groups for gender, then there is no difference. So, I mean, of course, we had mixed feelings about this. And I mean, of course, we would like to sort of do it again and flip the conditions. And then the next kind of 4 graphs are basically the results to those 2 questions that we asked them. So these are 2 histograms. So that's why there's no error bars on them. They're just histograms. Female students versus male students, their responses to the question, like to what extent do you agree with like how fair it is if we choose their groups for them. So what you'll notice from the distribution is that male students tend to agree with that statement more than female students, right? So male students think that yeah, it would be more fair if you as the instructor like assigned me my group. But then if you go to the next graph, this is the preference question. So both male and female students, even though male students think it's more fair, both male and female students would still prefer that they choose their own groups. Okay, and then if we go to the next graph, it's looking at basically the same thing, but divided along performance, the performance dimension. So the histogram on the left represents low performing students. So students who scored had low FCI scores and like typically did poorly on the first exam. And so this is showing like the distribution to that question, the level of agreement with like whether they think we should assign the groups. And so you can see that high performing students, interestingly, agree more with the idea of the staff assigning the groups more than the low performing students. And then if you go to the next one, but still there's regardless of whether you're a high performer or a low performer, you would still prefer to pick your own groups. So again, this represents like only half of sort of the experiment. We need to repeat it to sort of see what to make of it. But I think what it's taught me, I went into this experiment thinking based on my experience from AP 50, where the students are working on, they're sort of in these semi-permanent groups, right? They're in 3-month-long grouping situations. Based on that context, I had the belief that the instructor should always make the group, right? Like regardless of the context. And then when we ran this experiment in my colleague's class, I began to sort of doubt that. And I think now, having heard Joss's presentation, I like the idea of letting them pick their own groups, but having sort of like some constraints imposed. If it's a temporary, if it's sort of like a one-off situation, like a group exam. I still think that if it's like a month-long project and a lot of the grade is being derived from the deliverables of a group, that the instructor should always make the group in that situation. anyway, that's the research. That's the data that I had to share with you today.
Thanks, Kelly. As usual, it's fascinating stuff. There were a few questions going on. I am completely unable to manipulate the chat now. It's frozen for me. We don't have much time at this point. Bruce, did you have one question? I think I saw yours.
Yeah, if you want, actually, thanks, Kellyanne. My question is really with respect to the improvement in test 2, because my gut feel would be in test 1 that strong students would seek out strong students, weak students would end up with weak students. So the question is, does the data show in test 2 that the weaker students were driving that improvement?
Oh yeah, that's such a good question. So basically, like, did we find the same discrepancy for low performers versus high performers between exam 1 and 2 as we did for gender? I think that's your question.
Yeah, like pretty much like.
And the answer is no. There was no difference between exam. I should have shown that plot. I didn't because it was like a negative result. There was no difference between like whether we made the groups versus whether the students made the groups in terms of high versus low performers, which again is very confusing to us. And I think difficult to interpret because of the entanglement. The first exam was considerably easier than the second exam, which is another reason why we want to repeat it and flip the conditions. And so it's difficult to disentangle that that difficulty differential from the experiment. So the answer is no, we didn't find anything, but like I think we probably would if we did it again.
Cool. Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, thanks, Kelly. That's, like I said, that's really interesting. There are people with other questions, but we're going to save them for later for the sake of time so we can get to that panel discussion. So our third and final presenter of research is Matt Olin from the from Purdue University. Matt is an education researcher in engineering.
Thanks, Phoebe. So I've not done well at putting in all of the references for all of these points, but I can certainly provide those. And I'm focused on peer evaluation, which it tends to be more of a tool for use for teams that are together longer. So I'm glad Kelly transitioned there at the end to talk about when we have teams that are together for a longer period of time, especially when the stakes are higher, we need to put a little bit more thought into the way that the team dynamics work. And so the point here is we need some way of being able to monitor what's happening with our teams, and peer evaluation is a very effective way to do that for a number of reasons, especially because some of the work that a team does, especially on a long-term project, tends to be out of the eyes of an instructor, even when we're not faced with a pandemic. And so here are some benefits, right? Students are compelled in some way to reflect on their contributions to a team, both in sort of content and process. Instructors can identify dysfunction in various ways, and I'll talk about how we do that with the system that I use. Our ultimate goal is for teams to self-manage, right? For them to give and get feedback and act on it, and ultimately become better team members. But without constant intervention from us. And peer evaluation does allow that to happen, and there is definitely evidence of that. So let's go ahead and jump to the next one. So some of the more recent research on peer evaluation builds on a few important findings. One is feedback from a peer has more impact than feedback from an authority figure. And that's not a huge surprise given the stage of development of the students we typically work with, especially in my classes where I mostly teach first-year students. So they're even more bound up in those peer relationships. But that's true really for all of us. The research on that actually extends through adulthood. that we're more receptive to feedback from people who are in our peer group. Repeated use of a peer evaluation system, and actually this work was done in Canada, that repeated use of a peer evaluation system improves team skills and improves the ability to give feedback. And I have research as well that backs that up. So especially as students use the same instrument for doing peer evaluation repeatedly, both their team skills and their ability to give accurate and useful feedback improves. So that's great news. Next one. So different people are probably aware of varying ways of doing peer evaluation. I'll be speaking more about the first one, which is CAPME. It's behaviorally anchored. So it has different levels of contribution on multiple dimensions and verbal descriptors of what those behaviors look like. Another one is Spark Plus. Spark Plus has the disadvantage that it is not, there's no scientifically developed instrument. In fact, the instrument is developed sort of by teams in partnership with the instructor, but that has the advantage of student agency, right? So especially for more mature teams, that might be a more effective solution, but you lose the ability to compare results and to do any research because the instruments will all be ad hoc. Also common, you may have seen behavioral or frequency checklists, right? How often or how well does a particular teammate engage in certain behaviors? Those tend to be very long, Likert scale sorts of instruments and very difficult to use, especially at scale. And then finally, you may have seen zero-sum distribution sorts of methods. You have 100% of something to assign to in proportion to your teammates. So if everyone contributed equally, a 5-person team, everybody gets 20%. In a 4-person team, everyone gets 25%. Those struggle from an increased level of social pressure because to recognize one person's exceptional contribution, you have to take credit away directly from another person, and possibly that person might be yourself. So it puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the user. So let's talk a little bit more about the CAPME system as a research to practice opportunity there. So this is the CAPME model. It recognizes 5 contributions. It was scientifically developed. The anchors themselves are written to be instructive. And so students actually, and we've shown that students actually do learn as they adopt a common model of teamwork. And so in summary, the top 3 categories of behavior for most students contributing to the team's work is effort, interacting with teammates, basically comes down to don't be a jerk, and having relevant knowledge, skills, and ability is don't be stupid, as the students would word those. Keeping the team on track is focused on monitoring conditions that affect the team, and expecting quality is both about expecting that the team can do good work and compelling it to do so. So encouraging people to do a better job. Next. So there are a number of features of the system that are designed to make it better, both for students and for instructors. On the student side, their ability to rate well improves through doing practice and feedback where the social pressure is absent. So they're given scenarios where an individual student's behavior is described, and then they rate that student based on that descriptive behavior. And so they get immediate feedback on each of the different dimensions, and as a result, their ability to evaluate students on the fly in actual team activity tend to become more accurate. And I say more accurate based on data on inter-rater agreement regarding their contributions. Next. Since it's a behaviorally anchored system, the students never see numbers derived from these. We do compute numbers, which I'll show you in a moment. But the students receive feedback that looks like this, which tells them in the first column, a reminder, this is how you said you behaved. The second column is, this is how your teammates say you behaved. And then to put that in context, this is the average rating on this dimension on the team, so that they know whether the entire team's ratings are inflated, or if it, in fact, in this case, the team is telling them that they behaved above the expectations within the team. So good news for this student. Next. The students also, an instructor can optionally, they can collect verbal feedback about each student from each student, and again, optionally can share that directly with students, and finally, optionally can reveal who wrote each comment. This, of course, has been de-identified, but it's displayed in a grid, which allows, as we read across, we can see different students' perspective on the behavior of a single student. And as we read down a column, we can see a single student's feedback on multiple students on the team, so we can tell if they were excessively harsh. And so the triangulation here is very useful in determining what's actually happening in a team. Next one. We base a lot of, and we do, as I said, convert those ratings into numbers behind the scenes. The students never see those. But the rating number patterns allow us to determine a lot of things that are related to function and dysfunction. So we base those kinds of exceptional conditions on self-other discrepancies, so difference between self-ratings and peer ratings. Social loafing indicators where multiple team members have indicated someone is contributing below expectations. The lack of consensus is telling. And then finally, we can identify formation of cliques where two groups of students are sort of counter rating each other as high performers or low performers. And so it allows us to tell when a team has split into two teams that are fighting with each other. And then next. So this is how that data is displayed. Warnings to instructors show up in the far column. The summary pattern of ratings there is shown, but an instructor can also go behind the scenes to look at individual ratings by individual students. It's a bit of an overwhelming amount of data, and so it really helps to start with those highlighted conditions that have alerted an instructor to a particular dynamic, right? A high-performing student is shown. A low-performing student, for that to show up, it requires that a student acknowledges that their performance is below expectations. As opposed to, go ahead and take the next one. An overconfident student, which is in the middle of this screen, is someone who they say they're doing a great job, and their teammates say, "Oh, we don't agree with the way you assess yourself." A conflict is indicative of a student whose ratings are incongruous with other students' ratings of a particular team member, which can happen for a variety of reasons. And you can see the click condition is identified up there as well. And I see Michael is asking about the manip note. The students also never see these very judgmental labels, right? Like overconfident or manipulator, which is what that one is. The manipulator label will come up if a student has basically said, I'm fantastic, everyone else on my team is terrible. And in general, we call it manipulator because it looks like the student is betting that we are just like robots and don't pay attention to the details, and we just give them credit for everything, which we don't do. And a useful one actually is that underconfident label, which is a student who is rated higher by their teammates than they would rate themselves. And that can be really telling for marginalized students who can get a pat on the back out of that pattern. So next one. I did want to just wrap this up with, there is also research that indicates a number of practices that improve the accuracy of peer evaluations. And this research is done all over the place, some in Australia, some in Israel at the Technion. Again, I could provide references if you'd like. Administering peer evaluations multiple times is useful. It gets over the novelty. People learn to use the instrument and they get comfortable giving feedback. Administering after deliverables raises the stakes of the accuracy, and so students are more likely to take it seriously. Giving credit for engaging in the activity is important, not necessarily for how they do in it. And seconding the issue of the utility of the data being an important characteristic for students to take it seriously is that the instructor use the data somehow And actually, there's a bunch of research. It doesn't seem to matter what the use is, if it's intervention or if it's to release to the students for them to engage in a feedback process and account for how they've changed their behavior. There are lots of different ways to account for the quote using the data option, but to make sure that the students know that that their words are not just being launched into space without consequence is important. And I see some things popping up in the chat. So I'm hoping that Phoebe is keeping track of that.
I am.
I believe that's my last slide.
That is.
And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Matt. Much appreciated. I'm very interested in CATME. Kelly has just typed in the chat here that she uses CATME in her AP 50 class and finds the labels extremely helpful for starting important conversations. And also Matt Tamara has asked for the references. So if you are able to provide them after, we can share them.
I sure will. Yeah, I'll comment. I'll add to Kelly's comment that the faculty who use CATME have generally reported that the most useful part of the system are those labels, which is fascinating because that's the only part of the system that isn't scientifically developed. It's completely heuristic based on experience of people on our team and our work with teams over the years. We sort of guessed at what indicators in the ratings would predict certain kinds of dysfunction, and we apparently did fairly well at that. So
next research project.
Right.
So I know that there are questions. We're going to move into the panel discussion, so we have enough time. The questions that I put up at the beginning are on the screen, but I'm going to actually stop screen sharing at this point so we can see each other's faces for a while. So just have a quick glance and remind yourself if you need to, and I'm sure you have your own questions. I'm going to start by asking, well, I'll introduce our panel again. Okay, so we have Joss and Kelly and Matt, who you just heard from, and we also have joining us for the panel, Jackie Stewart from UBC. She's waving at you there. We have Sydney Omelon from McGill and Michael Dugdale from John Abbott College. So thank you to the 6 of you for helping us out today and sharing your expertise. Perhaps before we go into more of a Q&A, we can address some of the questions we had gathered. So maybe starting with the first one, which was what principles, so there's all this research we've looked at now and we've explored and we've thought about the context of the research and our own context as practitioners. So what principles can we use to build our group work practices, considering all of our very different contexts?
Maybe I'll dare to go first on this.
Please.
All right, so my context is that I benefited from a pretty forward-thinking undergraduate experience with a professor who engaged in group work and this kind of disruptive, I'm going to not put you with your friends, and that benefited my career. And my career in industry has involved like consulting engineering, working in operations and extractive metallurgy, and also a green tech startup in Silicon Valley. So I've gone back to academia, and it really is to loop in a lot of what I saw benefited my career that may not have been obvious at the time. So I'll just declare right away, I'm a huge CATME fan. Thank you for creating it. I know it must have been painful, but I'm very happy with this so far, its use. And I also think I've already seen, it's only been about 2 years I've used it, and students have also come back to say how much they appreciate its impact on their learning and on their experience. But to the point, I feel that part of what I've learned as more of a practitioner than a research person in this field of education is one, finding out quickly, discussing the value of grades. So for example, one of the things I think that comes up is some students just need a good grade to stay in school. And it's like, they're going to be kicked out if they lose their scholarship. Versus other students where it's like, mom and dad are paying, it's fine, I'm just here to like learn stuff for fun. Versus I love engineering, I'm going to get an A because I want to know more than the professor does. And I feel like that conversation before group work really helps students to understand they're not all the same. right? It seems like you think that sometimes they just don't know that. So it's important to say, like, what is the value of the grade for you? Because then that helps the team understand the pressures other students might have, right? And this really helps with early calibration. And the second thing I've noticed as a practitioner is that I totally understand the result. Well, I like to think I have, like I saw it nodding, the results of the groups that say we'd rather work together, but we think it's better if we don't. And I think that's a conflict between tribalism, which is students are more comfortable amongst those that they kind of feel comfortable around. So that sort of helps them feel good about themselves in life, but they're there to learn, right? So something I try and tell my students early is that I'm not here to be your friend. I'm here to help you get better at the skills I think will benefit your career. And I always loop this back to, like, yes, I'm pushing you to the point of discomfort, but these are the reasons why. And all the people you will meet through undergrad, you will see in your future careers, and you're going to have to manage them there too. So best practice now these difficult conversations. So I find what's helpful about CATME is if I bring in this subject early and then I follow through, like Matt said, you have to show that you're using it. Students really enjoy that.
Thanks, Sydney. Jackie, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. That was actually a good kind of introduction to what I thought I would bring. And again, from a practitioner point of view, a few years ago when I was teaching our communicating chemistry class, which is a course that all of our majors take, I thought about this group work piece. And I think so many times students hear, well, group work's good. My professor says it's good, and I'll use it in the real world. And they do hear that from us, but I think it's really easy for that to be still an abstract concept. Like, what does that look like? And so I guess the principle, if I can connect it to your questions, Phoebe, is making this concrete. So one way that I did that is I actually invited somebody from our careers office to collaborate with me, and he came to 3 of our classes. And we unpacked this. And I think having him there made that really concrete, that this is a direct connection to careers. So he talked about, what makes effective teams in industry and how companies are really invested in this. And then we also made it concrete by coming back at the end of term and really saying, what did you learn? And so we did an activity where they pulled up their resume and we had them edit their resume based on our class project. And that was a way to kind of really, again, make it concrete. So not all of your institutions maybe have careers people on hand, but many of them probably do. And I know they're always really interested in coming into classrooms and collaborating with people who are teaching. So I thought I'd offer that as a suggestion in case people are looking for ways to get beyond that, like teamwork's important, so I'm going to make you do it. But what does it look like and why?
Kelly, do you have something to add? You look like you're about to speak, but you're...
Yeah, I wanted to sort of mirror what Sydney said about the importance of having a conversation with students about how different members of the group can have different expectations about the example I think that you used was grades, but I think it could be extrapolated really to any like setting expectations conversation. One of the things that we do in AP 50, where the students are working in these semi-permanent groups, is we have them write, they have to come up with a contract that they all sign. And I think that something that Matt said also reminded me of the fact that like what CATME is great for. I mean, CATME is great for so many things, but is just having, it provides a scaffolding for like setting sort of what the expected behaviors are, right? Like, I mean, there's this, you can point to something specific and say, this is how your peers are going to evaluate you. Like, now that you know that, like, what do you think is reasonable to expect of each other? And we have them sort of like type up a contract, they all sign it, they hand it in, they talk about how they're going to resolve conflict, like what their sort of general expectations are. I just think that is really important. It's a really important skill that, you can bring to really any group experience. And anyway, that's.
Thanks, Kelly. Joss, I believe you have your hand up.
Sure, thanks, Phoebe. I just wanted to come back to the context piece a little bit, because really taking a little bit of time to reflect on why on earth are you using group work and what are you hoping the students will actually get out of it kind of needs to be your starting point in terms of a whole bunch of the decision making you're going to make, right? So for us in the example of using the two-stage group exams, we also use peer instruction with clickers and worksheets in class. And so one of the things we're doing is we're reinforcing what's happening in class with our assessment practices. We're saying, we value this in class, we value this on assessments, right? We also know from a lot of surveying with the students that the students tend to really like group exams, and having them walk out of the room with a smile on their face instead of not making eye contact when they hand you an exam is a radically different experience, right? So group exams might not have to do anything more than change that for me to decide that they're productive.
Oh, sorry. My everything is delayed for me over here. Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Phoebe. Professor Miller, I had a question for you, actually. I'm hoping we can go back to looking at the data that you're presenting, the difference between the student self-selection versus the teacher's self-selection of the groups, and contrasting how the students felt about the group success versus their actual outcomes. My brain is reeling from everything you just talked about, so I was left, when you mentioned it, with the impression that there was a very small marginal, there was a large gap in perception, but a small gap in performance. Am I recalling correctly?
Yeah, I mean, the performance, I think the performance data, we found this like interesting gender discrepancy.
Yeah.
Between, you know, if we let the students choose their groups, that seems to advantage women in terms of like the differential between individual exam performance and group exam performance. But again, because
couldn't reverse it.
Like because we weren't able to run it again with and there was a difference in difficulty, it's hard to say. I think that the sort of more salient point was the perception, is that, you know, students, while they might feel that it's more fair for us as instructors to make the groups, they would still prefer to choose their own. And I think that some of that might be, you know, what Joss mentioned earlier, is that there's a level of comfort. You know, if you're letting students choose their own groups, it's hard to say exactly how they're choosing. You know, like we looked to see if we could figure out, like, if you let students choose their own groups, does that mean that there's more single sex teams, like the men clump together and the women clump together, versus if we distribute the gender? And that's not the case. There's actually no different, that there's still gender mixed teams when you let them choose their team, because we thought that would be like an easy explanation.
Okay. So I wasn't misremembering, but I guess the heretical thought that was going through my mind while you were presenting that data is that maybe we're all overthinking this a little, because I thought, going back to like the first time I saw Eric Mazur talking about this, the idea behind the group work being that the students being in the same context had a better way of communicating their misunderstandings to each other and therefore negotiating through it. And in some way, that even if we have some set of measures that says this group will work optimally, that might be true academically, but it's sort of in some cases counter to the whole idea of the peer instruction, I feel, perhaps. Is that possible?
Yeah, I think it comes back to this issue of context. I think that when you're grouping students just for the purpose of a two-part collaborative exam, I think of that as sort of like akin to a peer instruction experience, where like the value of a two-part collaborative exam is, during the group exam, the students are explaining the physics to each other, right? It's really like, I mean, it's really just that. So possibly for that kind of a thing, it's better to just let them self-select, because they're going to be more comfortable with each other, and they're going to have more productive conversations if they're more comfortable with each other. In the context of the projects, like the first set of data that I presented, one of our goals is we want students to learn how to work with students who are not like them. And so that's part of like the mission statement of the course.
Yeah,
and
there's an additional goal there, but I was just thinking, just because I'm dealing with much smaller groups and
right. So I think it's just totally different, but I think you're right. Like if, and that's what seeing this data was what made me like rethink like, oh, like the premise that you should always form as the instructor, you should always form the groups. I think that there's probably cases where that's not true.
And I'm thinking maybe just for implementation, I don't need to use CADME. I've only got a group of like 20 students in my class, right? So I know them individually. But maybe something that Professor Ullman and Professor Olahan said, this idea, going back to what Josh was talking about, the idea of informing them ahead of time what the purpose of the groups is, letting them negotiate their own groups, but making them aware of what the difficulties of group formation can be if they're disbalanced. Right. Maybe that's a better route for someone in my context.
Yeah,
I hope to see your data later, but
I think Michael, you had your hand up next.
Yeah, I just want to first of all thank the presenters. I've been stealing references along all afternoon, so I've got some reading ahead of me. I just wanted though bring it back to that notion of principles, and I think that slide that you had up earlier on, which showing the triangle of pedagogy, orchestration, and group work sort of in tension with each other, and research sort of at the center informing those. So I think that I really do want to highlight that notion of the importance of the context, that classroom context that you're talking about. And I think Kelly was just referencing that to what is the purpose of your group. What is the purpose of your group is going to inform the pedagogy you're using, is going to constrain the orchestration you're able to use, and that in turn is going to come back and affect your group work implementation. And as an example, I use small groups for problem solving sessions in a class, and the groups are persistent, but the project is sort of one-off. But I also use two-stage exams, two-stage tests. And when they come in, and those are groups that are formed sort of on the fly geographically. The students know about this beforehand, so some of them sort of strategically sit next to each other to enhance their chances of being in the same group. But the purpose of that is more, as Joss had mentioned, feedback for the students, a little bit of affect. They're getting the feedback, and they're realizing they didn't bomb the test, or there's less anxiety around it, and it does help sort of that immediacy of sort of that peer instruction like discussion. I think, as Kelly meant, is sort of that immediacy there. Whereas when you're doing problem solving, it's a little bit longer if you're doing it from scratch, rather than sort of a problem that you've already seen in the first part of that test. So those contexts are a little bit different, and they really do affect how you're designing and how you're balancing that triangle. So that would be that would just my little comment on the principles is look at your context and look at your constraints, and that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. I'm not seeing any specific questions. If you have them and I just can't see them, let me know. We have time to address one of our other questions. I think in terms of homogeneous versus heterogeneous groups, it was actually fairly well discussed by our presenters, although we could go on for a long time. I think Joss had some choice words to say about that. So perhaps our panel could consider the question of the impacts that our choices on group work have on our students, and the intersection of that with issues of marginalization, of gender, race, socioeconomic status, LGBTQ. I'll leave it at that and see what you have to say. Matt?
So yeah, I'll jump in with a little of our more recent work on this. So one of the things we're trying to develop as another predictor where we would be able to flag certain conditions in a team as being problematic is a measure of psychological safety that's collected within the CATME system. It's not developed by us, but we use a published measure. And so in our first year engineering program at Purdue, we have a lot of students, and so it gives us a good pool to work with to look and see how that develops. And it was fascinating to see. There was no gender bias in. We just did a regression of the psychological safety, just a very simple look at that. And so there was Black students were less likely to be psychologically safe, but women were not. In engineering, they definitely are a marginalized population, but they were not less psychologically safe. International students were less psychologically safe, and independent of the coefficient for international students, there was also another, the students who were less comfortable in English, as measured by the language of instruction of the institution they attended before Purdue. If it was very different from English, which for us means mostly students from China, they also suffered an additional penalty to their psychological safety. But the most stunning result was, in spite of the very low number of students who did not choose a binary gender, the third option was other or prefer not to answer, because we had some concerns over what students would think we were doing with that data. There was a very small number of students who chose that option, and yet it was still statistically significantly lower, which the only way for that to happen with a small population is for them to have a consistently bad experience in teams. So we're alerted to this problem, and we're actually reaching out to our LGBTQ center, which has they have a much greater depth of knowledge of how students identify on campus. So we're trying to have an independent party take their data and our data, connect them, and give us a much bigger picture of what's happening there, because their data was collected without me having access, and my data was collected without them having access. But we can merge the data sets on a common identifier. It's just that neither one of us can actually do the research. So it's an interesting ethical challenge, but it's important to us, and we're trying to go through that process.
Thank you, Matt.
Me from the practicing side, I can also say that almost every time I use CatMe, the students ask, why do I ask about gender as a question? And so it's also a useful chance to discuss, right, the effect of gender in groups and discuss the effect of gender in the workplace. So I find it a really nice discussion point initiator to have this question be asked, and then they answer. And I've had only a few that have do not wish to disclose, but also I've had female students resoundingly come back to me to say, thank you so much for not isolating us, because in previous groups they have been. And when there's just one other, they say, like, it just makes it so much better. And so also to the point of names, when you're out of school with lots of international students, it's really helpful to have that column. So I mentioned that to them too, but I'm like, I'm not familiar with what all your names mean. And so I'm sorry. So I declare my, I'm sorry, I'm not as worldly as I'd like to be kind of card, but I'm all willing and hoping to work on it. So I find it's a really good insertion point for discussion. I also think it's important to highlight that CatMe has surprised me in how it predicts the underperformers who feel, just like Matt said, that they're not doing so well, but their group thinks they're great. It's always been a minority student in my experience. I don't know how this works, but I'm super happy to think that they get this feedback that is peer and not through me. And so I'm a huge fan of how that flags. And the other thing I'd like to say too is when you have a big class and lots of things for your attention, like drawing your attention, I find CatMe does a fantastic job of pulling out conflicts in teams so you can intervene early, which I think is another reason why students are thankful that you're monitoring, and you're actually, because the students talk amongst each other, they know who the problem groups are. And so when you find that group and start discussing with them, I think that also shows a lot of feedback that you're trying to help them become functional amongst dysfunction, and then reminding them that you'll be assigned to whoever when you get to your job. You don't choose your people you work with. And so we're here to give you skills and help you learn how to manage. And also, I have to say once to the feedback, the repeated use, I've had heartbreakingly wonderful feedback from students who said, I was that low performer. I just didn't have a scaffold for which to understand team performance. But he said, I was the better team performer the next group I had when I was surrounded by students who didn't know how to be a good team member. So I just really value the choice of skills, the words used, and the gradient in these capacities. It instructs them in their own minds, which I think is one of its great assets.
Thanks, Sydney.
And I don't get any, kickbacks for these comments.
Yet. Bye, Jackie. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise. So we are drawing to the end. It's almost 4 p.m. The feedback form has been posted. Again, if you didn't have access to it, it's in the chat, just a few comments from the bottom. We'd really appreciate it if you can do that. And thank you for joining us today for part 2 of our Teamwork Challenge. We'll be having another webinar at some point. I'm sure you'll hear from us. I can't tell you what it's on yet. It's a secret. And thank you to all of our presenters. It's been fascinating.
But part 3 is how we work as a team, right?
Yeah, it'll just be us.
I just wanted to say thanks everyone for showing up. But if you want to sneak a couple more minutes, Kelly had her hand raised and maybe wanted to add something.
I just wanted to say one more thing about CATME regarding the discussion we were just having about like underrepresented minorities and gender. And there is a feature at the end of the survey where students can write a confidential comment to the instructor. And the first time I used CATME, I just assumed that nobody would fill that out, like that people would just leave it blank because it's kind of an optional thing. And there have been so many times where students have written things that we've actually had to pass to Title IX at the university because it's almost always a female student who has felt uncomfortable with the way she's been treated by male students on her team. And she's written about that in depth in the confidential, she hasn't it's much easier for a student to type that into a text field on a computer than it is to go to the instructor and to explain like face to face what's happened. And I just find it to be like a very useful way of starting the conversation. So like every time I see that, it just like, I reach out to the student and then have a conversation and then, like take the appropriate channels through Title IX. And I just wanted to say that is an incredible feature of CATME that like, I think so many sort of things like that get caught as a result of like the ease that students feel like filling it out.
Agreed. And if I can add the students that are stressed about their grade and they know their teammates don't care about the grade and they do, it's a chance for them to say that to the instructor in a really professional way and with good context. So I find that's also very valuable.
Liz, was that your hand going up?
Yeah, I wanted to say, one of the things that I found really interesting about all of this conversation is that the data and the tools are really working hand in hand to help us understand this very complex setup. And I know that Chris, you just closed your video, but when you said that it's not as important for you because you have a small cohort, I disagree, because I think it doesn't make a difference how big our cohorts are. What I feel the tools are the data is supporting that we need tools to better understand the dimensions of what group work is. And the fact that group work is not, it's not without implications on both a personal psychological level, but also on grades, because the psychological performance or the sense of how I will perform does end up being what my grade is often. And until this conversation started, until the last, we've been preparing for this webinar, this 2 series for now over 2.5 months, I've learned a lot by just hearing what you all are doing. And I think that that's made me more aware that we need to know more. We need to understand more. We need to have better tools, and the tools are helping the students as well as helping us. And in the end, when we say active learning has a lot of group work, if we're doing anything negative to students, that would be a shame, by saying we're going to make them do more group work, and and thinking that it is what's the word I'm looking for, that it has no impact, that it's I'm missing that word, but I think anyway, all I'm saying, I guess, is this is fantastic. I think you all should I absolutely want to encourage this group of people to continue doing this kind of research and building more tools for us to use, and for us to start paying more attention to what you're doing. And I'm hoping that Salties will be able to help and encourage you to share again and again with us this kind of findings.
Thanks, Liz. I sent out a message to everyone. It takes a while to come through. Just officially the webinar is finished, but we always end up chatting after and continuing the discussion. So you're welcome to, I think, stick around, but anyone who has to go, presenter or otherwise, don't feel pressured to stay. And we appreciate all the time you guys have given us.
So if no one's jumping in with a question, I won't do the teacher thing or the mother thing, which is like, what do you think?
Can I rebut to you though, Liz?
Absolutely, that's what it's for.
Well, because when I say I got small group, and I feel Academy might be a bit of overkill for me, it's simply the fact that, and this is the one thing that I think will come away from the pandemic with and the online teaching, is that there is such a thing as too many platforms, right? I understand I've got this array of tools at my disposal to try and better how I can help guide the student through the learning process. But my groups have been small, and by that I meant is that I've never had difficulty interfacing with them, discussing with them, if necessary, as an aside, finding out what's bothering them. Because I notice in the small groups, I can see through body language, through outcomes, I get a very good read on what's happening. And okay, maybe there are instances that I need to think about this, but I can't, my burden seems a little too much of like, let's have another tool. I've already got tools that I've got and I'm trying to refine. And I don't see how do I say this? I don't see Cademy giving me such an exponentially large increase in outcomes that I want to start devoting myself to it for the groups that I have currently. I see its value as a tool. Like I can imagine if I was teaching to 120 students, I would not be able to live without it. But just for now, I don't think it's the thing that I need. I'd be more curious in seeing the outcomes of the research and like what is actually the relationship between gender composition in groups and self-selection versus teacher selection, because those are the things that I think are the most impactful and are easiest to interface with. I guess I'm saying I don't need technology to mediate that. I prefer to talk to people, but maybe that's just because I've been cooped up in my house for a year.
Yeah, and I guess, Mike, go ahead, Michael.
I was just going to say, though, I think the interesting thing with Cademy, I mean, I'm in a similar position with small groups. I do find the orchestration a little bit difficult, as I made the point in the last in the last webinar. If I don't attend to the group composition well, but you're right, I haven't used Cademy. I don't need that. The interesting thing about that, though, is the that I'm interested in is the research-driven nature of some of its, as Matt pointed out, some of the feedback was sort of not coming out of the research, but a lot of it seemed to be based around that. And I think just learning what are the axes it's basing its various decisions on can be informative. So I mean, if nothing else, I mean, it might be overkill to a class of 40 or a class of 30 where you're splitting it into, 10 groups or for short group work sort of moments. But I think just as an embodiment of some of the research there, that it may be an interesting thing to look at nonetheless.
Yeah, I like, and I like Jose's comment. I think, no, it presents a back channel, and because I wonder about that, as a minority, I don't always, you might not know what I'm thinking. Like I might act a certain way and you might think that I'm okay because I've learned to cope. I've learned how to present. And it may be a nice way to be able to do that, knowing that this is part of the system. It's not like I have to come see you and tell you that I'm having a difficult time. And I think that that's something that we're not, myself included, I'm not always sensitive enough to what other minorities feel. And I think some of the idea of gender preferences, the fact that that's also one of those things that is not obvious to us unless we are part of that community. Hands are raised.
Go ahead, Joss.
Well, I raised my hand after you.
I know, but that's my job.
I see. Okay, all I was going to say, I was just going to follow up on what I commented on is, an easy way to kind of make this back channel a consistent thing that's present is to just once a week pick a very low stakes question, how is the online homework system working for you, whatever, and then have an additional comments box. And the students that need to reach out to you that wouldn't just send you an email, but might have something to say, they will often do it through that channel.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say much different. I think you guys already brought it up. It's that often I have this problem. You feel, especially when you're in the classroom with your students, and we have classes of 40 odd. But if I can only imagine with half that number, and you're working with them regularly, especially if they're more permanent groups, persistent, you start to feel like you know them so well, and that you have everything completely under control. And you do. I mean, you probably do at the large scale level. But I'm just constantly surprised when I learn something that I never knew was going on. And so it's nice. Doesn't have to be through CAPME, but like everyone's suggesting, to have a way to learn more. And it's something I've learned going online, because suddenly I just went blank. I realized how much of my input I gathered just being in the room with my students and reading, like you said. Is Chris even here still? No. The body language, like, it changed everything. And then I did switch to, I just used Teammates this semester because I didn't know about CAPME until it was too late. But I had to switch, and even last semester I had to switch immediately to some kind of peer assessment to get that feedback. But I think that when we go back in person, I'm going to need to use something still, because now I see the extra insight that I never saw before.
Just to follow on that point of the back channel is just a little anecdote. We had a survey out to students on how they were coping, how they were doing during the pandemic with the online classes and that. And there was and we've had very much in your face, look, if you're having any trouble here, click here, here's one-stop shop for all of our support services and that. But there was also on this survey, which was just sort of a quick survey that was accessed from that same place, here's a little text box. If you feel you really need to reach out, write something in. And we had well, it was over 20% of the respondents used that feature. That I mean, I caught everybody by surprise, but that it is not just having sort of regular channels doesn't, it won't always, attract the kind of responses that perhaps you want to be. And I thought this one was, I mean, it was on the one hand, a little alarming that that it was that high, but it was heartening that they've, took that opportunity to seek out help in that context, and we were able to put them in touch with the guidance counselor services and the other support services. But that notion of having, it was Kelly was describing, having these sort of more serious things coming through this channel actually doesn't surprise me, given its availability. So,
and Jose, you don't use CatMe, right? So, no, but you're using other tools, and that to me would be really interesting, because the questions that you asked in your research go really, it's revealing some really nice subtle pieces about what are these variables that we need to be paying attention to. It might be something that could be added to CatMe, seeing that it's, CatMe is not, some sort of big corporation. It's really Matt and his colleagues, right? And certainly, if nothing else, becoming more sensitive as we start recognizing the importance of, gender identity and those kinds of issues. And how they may be impacting how people feel comfortable or not. Because I think that's one of the things that I've become much more sensitive to over the course of the past 2.5 months, is how much we make assumptions about group work, what the formation of the groups are. And how actually I'd love to bring this research and this research group to some of the other research groups that we've been talking about, talking to. And they're talking about the kinds of conversations that are more effective. So there's a group of people looking at what they call transactivity. And so that's Armin Weinberger's work. And transactive conversations are the ones that are producing the most positive learning outcomes. And those are asking when students are able to be aware of, I'm simplifying it, of the other, and able to not close their not decision making, but their thinking process. So not coming to a conclusion fast. In other words, being open to other people's point of perspectives, or the different perspectives of the question at hand. If it's not other people's perspectives, but other perspectives, and exploring other perspectives. So that to me would be an interesting way for us to start looking at, are the tools you're currently using to say that the group is successful also showing us something like successful? I think that was the question you asked when we were having our conversations. Like we said effective, and you asked the question, what does effective mean, right? Like what are we measuring to say this is an effective group? And that to me is probably we didn't talk about it today, even though we asked the question. But that to me is a really important question, because if we're looking at the wrong thing, the groups might be working, but they're not learning. Or what is learning? If it's being able to answer questions better, yes, but is it able to think more deeply in the ways that we want people to think, which is to explore different perspectives on an answer, are they doing that? So I guess I'm asking you some questions without asking you questions. So unless somebody has an answer, maybe we can close down, or Josh, if you want to have the last word.
No, I'm good, thank you, Liz. I'll leave that as a provocative final question or set of questions.
Fantastic. Thank you again for joining us. And thank you all for those hanging out, waiting with us and exploring these ideas. Selma, do you have a thought before we close down?
I want to thank everyone for a very stimulating and interesting session. And thank you, Liz and the Saltese gang, for putting this together. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Selma Hamdani. I'm the co-coordinator of Dawson Active Learning Community at Dawson College. And I teach psychology, and this was right up my alley. I was eating this up and writing notes. I think I wrote in the chat how I agree with what you were saying, Liz, is that there's we cannot make assumptions about observations and overt behaviors, because there's lots of covert stuff happening that we may not be aware of. And if we want to offer a safe space for our students to optimize their learning, whether it's a small group or a large group or medium group, we have to provide, we have to give them the opportunity to express themselves safely and tell us what's happening. And that's how we can optimize learning, even as an extension of that. So I'm super happy to hear that there are these tools, being created. I'm looking forward to playing around with them and bringing it to my colleagues in our department. I mean, obviously in psychology, we care about, much like everyone else, we're concerned about student well-being, and but we've never used formal tools like this. We've always just used reflections and some self-evaluations and peer evaluations that we sort of created internally. But I think it's time we have something more and something standardized too. I think that would be really key. So thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Bye. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye.